Before we start the tutorial, you should know some basics about the King's Indian defense, as I want your complete focus in the video. Most players are confused about the King's Indian defense and the King's Indian setup. The King's Indian defense is an opening, while the King's Indian setup is a structure. This structure can be found in various openings, but you will mostly see it in the King's Indian defense. The position you see on the board is a King's Indian setup. However, the most common mistake beginners make in the King's Indian defense is that they suddenly play knight to f6 after e4, which is the wrong move. After e4, go for d6, then knight to f6. Well, the good thing about the King's Indian setup is that you can play it from both sides. No matter what your opponent's first move is, you will get the same position. Alright, I think I've explained the important basic things you need to know during the King's Indian defense. Are you ready? So welcome to the masterclass of the King's Indian defense. As I told you earlier, no matter what your opponent's first move is, you will get that position. Let's say they play e4. You play pawn to d6, then pawn to d4, pawn to g6. Probably, they play pawn to c4 because these three pawns are more hyperactive in the center now. Play knight to f6. You are targeting this pawn, so your opponent will likely play knight to c3. Play bishop to g7, knight to f3, kingside castle, and bishop to e2. Congratulations, you have developed the King's Indian setup against your opponent's first move e4. But according to chess rules, the King's Indian defense often arises after d4. Let's start from there. So pawn to d4, knight to f6, c4, g6, knight to c3, bishop to g7, e4. Please keep in mind, if your opponent ever plays e4, then always go for d6. Okay, knight to f3, kingside castle, and bishop to e2. Now you are in that position again, but let's go 3 steps back. Please keep this position in your mind because this position is known as the King's Indian, and every variation arises from here. I will discuss 3 variations in this video. Let's start with the first one, which starts after knight to f3, simply castle. White plays bishop to e2 for kingside castle. Mostly, grandmasters go for pawn to e5, but play knight to a6 before e5, kingside castle. Now play pawn to e5, takes, queen takes queen, rook takes queen, knight captures pawn, knight captures knight, bishop captures knight. Although this position looks equal, black has more advantage to win this position. Now let's jump back to the second variation, the 4-pawn attack, which begins with pawn to f4, castle, then knight to f3. This position looks like white has more control of the center compared to black, but don't worry, just play pawn to c5. White plays pawn to d5, go for pawn to e6. Well, white's king is in the center, so it will try to bring it to the corner. Play knight to d7. White plays pawn to h3 to kick off the bishop. Takes. Well, this position looks complex for both sides, which is why your opponent is as confused as you. But the third variation is really good, and my favorite one also, which arises after bishop to e2. Again, castle. Most of the time, players go for bishop to g5, but our process is the same. Knight to a6. White is adding more pieces to our kingside. Pawn to e5, d5, knight to c5. This pawn has 2 attackers but 1 defender, so pawn to f3, pawn to a5, pawn to g4. Now, my viewers, I want your complete focus here. Go for pawn to h6. White takes. Don't take it back. Sacrifice your knight. Pawn takes. Give check. King to d1. Now capture the bishop. You are targeting white's queen, so queen to c2. Go for bishop to e3. Maybe white goes knight to b5 so that he can capture this pawn. Takes. Queen to f2. Knight captures rook, but this is checkmate, okay? As I promised in the previous video, I explained the King's Indian defense in a very simple way, and my next video is fully dedicated to the Sicilian defense. But if you are not familiar with what's going on here, then check out my previous video. But if you already watched that, then check out my dragon variation video, which is part of the Sicilian defense. Thank you so much.